If you are preparing a catalogue, one of the main things you need to do is classify coins. For a lot of catalogues, this is pretty straightforward. In syllogies, exhibition, or sales catalogues, you almost certainly already have an established system of classification, and you just need to identify what type or variety your coin is. And it's pretty easy when you're making a die catalogue, because the die, as a unit of analysis, is a concrete thing. But it's much trickier for a type catalogue. That is because while type is an important numismatic concept, it is a concept that we impose on the coins. In fact, the whole series type variety hierarchy is a construct, an imposition on the data. And depending on our purpose, we might define those things differently and utilise different criteria. For example, a type catalogue aimed at collectors and general readers might have a very different structure than one aimed at resolving a historical problem. And the methodological rule here is not complicated. Type and variety should serve the purpose of the catalogue. The problem is implementation. No one would disagree that the classification should serve a purpose, but rather, how do different taxonomies fulfill different purposes? And recently I was made very aware of how much these things could vary because I was preparing a concordance between the, as of the time of recording, not published Kushanshahs catalogue I'm working on with Joe Cribb and the classification in Robert Gobl's 1984 catalogue on the same coins. In the process of preparing that concordance, I couldn't help but notice how different at a very fundamental level the two systems of classification were. And I thought it would make an interesting concrete example. You're going to hear me say Gobl thought or Cribb thought quite a lot in this episode, and I'm not trying to suggest that I'm peering into the minds of the scholars in order to tell you what was really going on in their heads. I'm just using it as a shorthand to mean there is a coherent logic behind this, and this is what I think that coherent logic is. Let me start with the obvious differences in presentation. Gobl uses what I think of as an RIC type system, assigning to each distinct combination of obverse and reverse a number. These run sequentially. But where Gobl thought it was likely a type existed, but there was no extant example, he left a space in the numbering. So there is no 721 in his list, because he suspected a coin would turn up later to fill that gap. And Gobl was absolutely right in that intuition. The number of types, in Gobl's terms, has doubled since 1984. Cribb uses a very different system, dividing the coins into 3 chronological phases and then giving separate codes to obverse and reverse varieties. Those variety codes have 2 parts, a number and a letter, and those are hierarchical in their arrangement, so a 1B would be more similar to a 1A than it would be to a 2A. The combination of obverse and reverse variety we could then think of as being equivalent to a type in the system Gobl uses, though Cribb has a lot more of them. Some of that is just that Cribb had more data than Gobl, enough to justify at least 8 new types by Gobl standards, but Cribb has 28 obverse varieties and 24 reverse varieties. These are recorded in 37 combinations, which indicates that Cribb's typology is much more granular in its arrangement, part of why I'm calling Gobl's divisions types and Cribb's varieties. The two terms are not formally distinguished in numismatics, but it's normal to think of a variety as representing a smaller division than a type. The question of how granular your approach should be in a typology is obviously an important one. I polled colleagues on this particular question, and the consensus seems to be that trying to draw a formal distinction between variety and type, or to define in an abstract sense what exactly a type should be, is fundamentally counterproductive. That a typology should be as granular as it needs to be to serve the purposes that the historian wants it to serve. Again, while that's completely sound as a general statement of principle, it is extremely woolly, and hopefully we'll see in a moment by using the Cribb Gobl example how you might apply it in practice. To illustrate, let us take the distinction between Gobl's type 718 and 719. There is a small mark between the floating trident and the inscription on the left-hand side of the coin. For 718, this is a cross, and for 719, a circle with a line projecting from the top of it. Yes, these are really difficult to make out, so much so Gobl actually miscategorises one of the coins in the catalogue. The second coin of type 718 should actually be an example of 719. And these sorts of marks are so small that, while clearly intentional by the mint, they would not have been noticed by the users, and I think it was almost certainly the case that the mint didn't intend for users to see or recognise them. But the mint did put them on there on purpose, so there must have been some system behind it. And here is a central problem of numismatic typology. How do we reconstruct that system from the marks it made? How do we use that reconstruction to serve our purposes? Which in Gobl's case in 1984 was to sequence the coins. Gobl's main method was one of typological affinity. This group of coins was issued in the name of the Kushan ruler Vaharan, but by the Kidarites. So between the issues of the Kushanshahs and the issues of the Kidarites in their own names. Kushano-Sasanian coins consistently feature a swastika between the king's legs. Kidarite coins do not. So by affinity, it makes much more sense for those coins with a swastika in the period that falls in between, 713 and 713A, to precede those without. A lot of typological classification works like that. For example, Gobl assumed that 722 and 723 followed as 718 and 719 because they share control marks to the left of the trident, but the later coins add a new control mark under the altar, a common feature in the subsequent Kidarite period, but rare in the previous Kushanshah period. Gobl did also use some stylistic features, but the typology was primarily based on control marks and sequenced on a principle of affinity and the assumption that the mint operated a coherent and sequential system of marks. Now I want to draw attention to the very different criteria Cribb employed, and I can start by taking Gobl's later four types and blowing up the crowns. You can see they're engraved differently. Let's look at some slightly better images. Cribb identified three different styles of crown. I've picked out particularly clear examples of each. These are minor stylistic differences. If a coin was worn or you weren't looking at it blown up in a digital image, it would be very hard to tell these apart. And just saying that there are different styles of crown is not in itself enough to justify using them as a criteria for a typology. These could just be different engravers, or even variations by the same engraver. However, Cribb notes there is a tendency for other elements in the design to become cruder and less well defined, particularly the inscription, with certain crowns. And that's an important typological principle, because coin designs are duplicated by a process of manual copying. We expect that process to result in simplification and abstraction, like photocopying the same page over and over again. To illustrate, take the reverse inscription. You can see that it is in three parts, reading Borzowano Yazado. However, if we compare the middle part below the ground line, the exurg, with another coin, we can see that whereas the first has an actual inscription, the latter is just a squiggle. There is obviously a chronological order to that. An engraver can produce a squiggle by copying a correct inscription, but they can't produce a correct inscription by copying a squiggle. And that's why dividing the coins into varieties that reflect their stylistic differences is useful here. It allowed Cribb to sort the issues into an order, and that showed that the three styles of crown were not incidental. They were used consecutively, and thus are sensible points at which to mark the phases. We can now use the sequencing from Cribb's stylistic analysis to look at the control marks again. These are the known control marks in Cribb's order. The marks occur in 4 places: to the left of the trident, between the king's legs, above and below the tamga. And this is how Gobl's system maps onto Cribb's. As this illustrates, Gobl's criteria were not wildly off. The swastika marks are clearly the beginning of the sequence, and the use of a control mark below the tamga did tend to be a late feature. But it's not quite so simple as saying it simply comes at the end. The Mint clearly did not mind repeating the same marks. Gobl had assumed, quite reasonably I think, that they did not do that. As we discussed earlier, the issue at stake here is utility. The first system is simpler, the second one is hard to use, but that is a trade-off. It allows for greater granularity, and that in turn makes it possible to track the sequence more accurately. There is also just a limit on the choices you can make when doing this sort of analysis. I've noted already that Cribb had more coins. As we can see, only about half the marks known today, and this is probably still not a complete set. In fact, I know, as I'm recording this, of a new mark that showed up just a few days ago. So only about half of those marks were known to Gobl. With that limited sample, I'm not sure there was an alternative to using the control marks the way Gobl did. I don't think there was enough data to do it stylistically. But once you start to integrate the new combination of control marks, it would be very difficult to make sense of them, and you would be obligated then to follow the approach that Cribb did and find another criteria, in this case a stylistic one. In a very real sense, both sets of choices were the correct choice when they were made. To reiterate the general point, typology should suit the numismatist's purpose and should be as granular as it needs to be for that purpose. I realise in stating that it doesn't sound any less woolly as a taxonomic principle at the end of the episode than it did at the beginning, but hopefully with a concrete example of how it's applied, you're a little clearer on what numismatists actually do in practice when they hit these types of problems. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the episode.